afternoon, everyone. Sorry, I don't want to scare you. Last time I kind of shut everybody's conversation down. Welcome again to our lunch. We're really excited about this panel between my boss, the CEO of Wiley, Brian Napack, and Michael Feldstein. They're going to have a fireside chat. We have several topics they're going to cover, and then what we really want is to open it up to the room to give you guys some questions here. But I thought it was really important to have Brian in particular talk to everyone today. Brian has been involved in higher education in many different angles for years, understands the services and delivery business that we're in here at Wes and Learning House very well. And so I think he has a lot of perspective, plus is also running a publishing business, as many of you guys probably have read the news recently. We acquired Newton and have a lot of assets in higher education and have for decades. So we really see the landscape from many different angles. So I'm going to introduce Brian and Michael. I'm going to say a couple things about them in their bios so you have some context, and then we'll get started. Yep, you guys going up. Brian is the president and CEO of John Wiley & Sons. He joined Wiley December of 2017 as the 14th CEO in Wiley's 212-year history. Brian has devoted his career to the education, information, publishing, and media industries. From 2012 until he joined Wiley, Brian was a senior advisor with Providence Equity, one of the largest private equity investors in the world. During this period, he was focused on making and managing investments in his sectors and was an active director on the boards of numerous companies, including Ascend Learning, Blackboard, Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, Ingram Industries, EDMC, Burning Glass, Mayon, Recorded Books, Hot Chalk, and Synergis. So that's quite a list of names there. Michael Feldstein. Michael is a partner at MindWires Consulting, co-publisher of e-Literate and co-producer of e-Literate TV. Previously, he has been the senior program manager of MindTap at Cengage Learning and principal product strategy manager for Academic Enterprise Solutions, formerly Academic Enterprise Initiative at Oracle Corporation. Prior to that, Michael was an assistant director at the SUNY Learning Network, where he oversaw blended learning faculty development and was part of the leadership team for the LMS platform migration efforts of this 40-campus program. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Brian and Michael to have a nice chat that we can enjoy and participate in after you guys eat your food. By the way, I know this is a little non-traditional with eating and listening, so don't worry about it. Clank away. These guys know how to work through that kind of adversity, and we'll go from there. So thank you all. Enjoy lunch.
Afternoon, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be with you all here today, and of course, it's a pleasure to be with you, Brian. Have enjoyed my morning with you. First thing I want to say to you is that we're actually going to ask you to do three things at once: eat, listen, and participate. So there's a person with a microphone right there. Okay, so we're going to do this a little bit like a radio call-in show. So we're just going to have a conversation here, and I'm going to try to keep an eye on that mic as we talk. And if you have a question or something you want to say, just feel free to jump in. So
only nice questions, though.
Only
Okay?
nice.
Nothing threatening.
Right. We're a little fragile up here. There's no fire, as you noticed. That's a bad start to a fireside chat. And I was also disappointed there's no bourbon here. So I did have a bourbon apple fritter this morning, so that helped.
Should lubricate the conversation just a little bit. I like these chairs, Michael. They are very Star Trek reminiscent, aren't they?
They are.
I feel like I'm cruising
like
off into the galaxy.
I'm not an astronaut, but I do play one on TV now.
And for those of you who don't read Michael's work on e-Literate, you should. Michael is one of the luminaries in the industry and has some of the smartest insight and analysis anywhere. It's my plug for you, so you'll be nice to me.
Oh, thank you. It won't work, but I appreciate it. So Brian, let's start for a minute by talking about Wiley. From my experience, there are the sexy companies, and then there are the interesting ones. And often they don't overlap very much. Wiley has been one of the interesting ones. Family-run company. Never really overreached in the way that some of the other publishers. I don't remember hearing in the bio your publisher experience, but you've got publisher experience too. Just sort of had a steady hand and some good solid, values in its DNA. Acquired one of the early online program management companies. So, and that again will minimize the use of that term, but there's the work in helping schools come online has been around for a decade, and Wiley's services business has been, one of the more mature ones, right? And now you've added to it with Learning House, and then you came on board. When was that?
Only 2 years ago.
Okay.
Yeah.
So wow, time flies. So and we heard you've got some diverse experience. So when you put all that together, how would you, now 2 years in, how would you describe Wiley?
We're a textbook publisher.
Okay, there you go. All right, next question. Moving on.
So I usually in groups like this ask people if they had one word to describe Wiley, what it would be, and it is always textbooks. Textbooks, after 212 years, now represents around 10% of what we do. And when I say textbooks, I mean courseware and all the digital stuff that goes along with it. Wiley is an amazing company, and for me, having joined actually about 18 months ago, it was a dream come true for me to join Wiley. I grew up on Long Island in a neighborhood with a bunch of houses that looked the same, and each one of them had a family who moved out from Brooklyn, and typically the families came from the old country. And the way they got to where they were and the way their kids got to where they were going, including this stage, was education. And so when I had a chance many, many years ago to go to work for Simon & Schuster, that's actually 30 years ago this year, when I joined the education industry, to me it was knowledge, information, and at the time Simon & Schuster was the largest educational publishing company in the world, and the core assets of Simon & Schuster were the assets that became Pearson, the education company. So it was a big deal for me, and so I followed Wiley for 30 years. I was at Simon & Schuster, then I went out and started Disney's education business and their interactive businesses, and then ran Macmillan, the publishing company, with John Sargent, my partner there, for years, and then went into private equity, thinking that was a faster way to have great impact. And kept watching Wiley all the way through this, and while I was in private equity for 6 years, I realized a couple of things. One was that investing was different than doing, and I didn't like that. And two was there were a lot of people and a lot of money chasing a lot of opportunities that, quote unquote, were designed to improve education, but in fact were not. They were actually just about investors finding ways to make money within a 5-year time horizon, which is what that is about. And there's nothing wrong with that at all. But I want to be back on the field. And so when Wiley called, I had been watching for a long time, and in my mind, Wiley was this 210-year-old beautiful sailing ship out in New York Harbor that I had always admired. I knew it was a publisher. I knew some of the things they'd done. I knew they had invested in more than just content. They had invested in the services business, Wiley Education Services, which was formerly called Deltac. They had invested on the corporate side in a company called Cross Knowledge, which is a leader in corporate education. They had invested in a bunch of things that made them look just more forward-looking than a lot of the other companies, which were basically trying to figure out how to prop up an old textbook business. I also looked and I saw a company that was one of the world's leaders in scientific research. So when you think about Wiley, without prattling on for too long, Wiley is two things. Basically, Wiley's mission in life is to drive the world forward through research, scientific research, and education. And as the third largest research company and one of the largest education companies, we have a mission. And so I saw that sailing ship out in the harbor, and I thought, I'm gonna go play with those people. And I knew it was gonna be a beautiful sailing ship, but I didn't realize a number of things. One is I didn't realize the cool assets that were inside. So it wasn't just the services business and the textbook business and the courseware business and all of this, the cross-knowledge business and so forth. It also had a set of 5,000 colleagues, as we call our team members, who were completely passionate about changing the world. So you combine this forward-leaning company that had made these investments in all these different areas with this true, deep-felt mission and an ownership, which while we are a public company, in fact, we're the 7th or 8th, Jesse Wiley's actually here, he can tell us, we're one of the oldest companies on the New York Stock Exchange. We are controlled by the Wiley family. And if you have a chance to say hi to Jesse, you should, because the Wiley family is interested in one thing, and that is impact for the long term. So that's sort of the Wiley story, and I found that completely and utterly compelling. So now we're on that sailing ship, and we got wind in the sails, and we're sailing toward that mission, and we're thrilled to be in a room with all of you.
All right. So 200 years seems pretty old, right?
I am pretty old.
Yeah.
That is true.
I had the pleasure a couple of years ago to visit Bologna in Italy, which has the oldest university in the world. And in their medieval museum, if you ever get a chance to go and visit, they have these stone, only way I can describe them is sarcophagi of their professors that have carved on them images of their classes, which you would be surprised to see how familiar they look, right? They're lecture halls, and they've got students sitting like this, and others sitting like this, and right? So, you know, we're talking now about a 1,000-year-old tradition that we're all representing here in this room. And so I think what I'd like to do with our time is to kind of think as stewards of this 1,000-year-old tradition that has had such an influence on our civilization, and all of the challenges that we've heard about this morning and that you all think about every day in keeping that tradition alive and moving it forward, to try to integrate all of the pieces that we've heard into a big picture. And so I'd like to start with a phrase that we're all familiar with and that we take for granted, which is going back to school, right? I mean, that's a phrase we all grew up with. We go back to school. And there are two senses in which we can mean that. You know, there's the going back to school that you're already associated with, right? My father was an elementary school principal, so it was a family business kind of thing. And he would never sleep the night before the first day of school. And when I was a middle school teacher, it was the same thing for me. It's just a thing. You'd go back to school. At college, you know, when going back to school, I remember vividly at Rutgers sitting around with my friends looking through the catalog and figuring out which courses to go to and trying to make sure that, you know, I didn't have to get up too early on a Friday morning to go to, you know, right? And then there's the going back to school of, I've been out in the workforce for a few years and I decided I was gonna go get that PhD that I had been thinking about but didn't go directly on to. And that was, okay, now I have to go back to school. That was a different kind of going back to school and looking around, right? And there was also, even from high school to college, I didn't think about it as going back to school. It was assumed I would go on to college, but there was a kind of a ritual involved with that and visiting, right? And so we have kind of built into our mental DNA this idea of going back to school. But that's kind of changed, isn't it? This whole idea, these mental models that we have, right? I was sitting next to someone this morning who was telling me that her school did some research, and they have 4 generations of students that they're marketing to come back to school. So how are we to think about that? Well, going back to school, what does that mean today?
I think we're faced with this room and colleagues of all of ours in the industry are faced with a big, audacious challenge that we're starting to figure out how to solve, but haven't. And that challenge is how to make the mental transformation that you are putting in front of us, which is school's not a destination. School's a continuous thing. And we've talked about lifelong learning in the industry for as long as I've been in it, and I'm sure we'll talk about it forever. But lifelong learning indicates a pathway or a journey, and I think what we're trying to do in this room is figure out how to take education from being simply a destination where you go through it and you get a piece of paper, and then someday you wake up and maybe you need another one, or maybe you didn't complete it and somebody tells you have to have one, and so you go get a piece of paper, to one where we are actually, first of all, about the learner themselves, not about the school or the corporation. And that we are starting with the question of, where do I want to go as a learner? What do I want to achieve? And how to make sure that it's not this simple go back to school, get a piece of paper, but rather a continuous loop of education. A continuous loop where we are meeting the learner where they are and helping them to achieve their goals, where we're not as universities thinking about how can I get more students out. Let's face it, we know that education, particularly higher education, is one of the core pathways to not just individual success, but societal prosperity. This much is proven, but our answer to it thus far has been get more pieces of paper in people's hands. That's a supply side approach to this that is simply not enough. So the challenge we face is to move our mentality from how do we get more students in and students out with pieces of paper to how do we help that student achieve their goals, and what is the goal? The goal is to get a job or improve a job, to go from being unemployed to employed, or from being underemployed to fully employed, and to help your employer succeed as well as part of a collective team. Our job is not our job as an industry is not just to spray out graduates into the world and hope that they get jobs, but rather to talk to the demand side of the equation, to talk to the student and help the student achieve their goals. So I think what it means, what going back to school means in this context, and I think what's different, is now we as an industry have the ability to meet the student where they are, to give them the credentials that they need, if it's small, medium, or large, to do it on ground or online, or to do it hybrid, to do it if they're in a job now, or if they really do have 2 years or 4 years or however long to get whatever that certificate is. We have the power to actually understand what employers want and what employers need, and help the student to figure out how to get the skills that will actually get them into that job and allow them to be successful. So instead of go back to school as a simple, okay, I will get another piece of paper, we now have the ability, but we're not yet realizing the dream, of filling the demand curve, is what I call it, right? Filling the demand curve with all the different products and all the different modalities at all the different price points with the different brand names that mean something to those students. That's our challenge. Our challenge is how to meet the student where they are, help them achieve their goals, and do so on a continuous life cycle basis, so that student has a relationship with you for 20 years, not 2. And if we succeed at that, we are all succeeding. schools succeeding, the employers are succeeding, and most importantly, the students succeeding so that society at large can succeed.
So what I hear you saying is, as a student, as a person, I have lots of learning needs constantly, large or small, right? It might be a degree, it might be a short course, it might even be shorter than a course. It might be a fragment of a MOOC, right? A little tiny lesson, right? Mm-hmm. It might be career related, it might not be career related. It might be, something that alumni come back to their schools for the pleasure of continuing to learn, right? And that but there are all these gaps that we're just not hitting, right? So how do you figure out what those gaps are and start to fill them in?
Well, that's part of the power of what we have now is, for the first time, well, a couple things are happening. Corporations have been singularly unimpressed with the output of the education industry for a long period of time, and therefore they spend hundreds of billions of dollars a year on corporate training, trying to reskill, upskill, make people with those pieces of paper qualified entry-level employees, and then figure out how to get them going. So they've been unsatisfied for a long time, but they never had the lexicon with which to speak to universities about what those skills were that they need. And so the first thing we have to do as an industry is we have to align around a common taxonomy about what those skills are, what the jobs mean, what are the credentials that people need, how does a skill, hard skill or a soft skill, equally important, how do they nest into a collection? The good news is we now have the data to understand what the job market is saying. And so what we're trying to do in a number of different places is we're trying to build that common taxonomy. So through a project called DARE, which is Data and Analytics, I forget what the R and the E stand for. Should have done that. I always forget the R and the E. But basically what we're doing is we're working with Business Higher Ed Forum, Google, Burning Glass, who has a lot of the core data, a number of corporations and a number of universities, to build a common taxonomy around data and analytics curriculum, because obviously it's an important part of what's needed in society today, so that the employers and the schools can talk to each other. That's the answer to the question, right? We first have to develop a common taxonomy, and once we do, then we can figure out what the right degrees are, what nests into that degree, what the right certs are, and move on from there.
Okay, so let's say you've got all the offerings that students want and need. And when I say students, again, what we mean is humans, right? The idea is you're always going to be a student, right? If you're not a student, then you're asleep or dead. But there was another aspect of going back to school that we sort of take for granted or is invisible, right? So when I would go back to school as an undergraduate, this was before you could register for your courses online. In my day, we had to go and stand in line, right? Obviously picking a graduate school or even picking an undergraduate school, there was a lot of work. You visited the schools, you got your transcripts. We heard a little earlier about getting transcripts. And it's true today, and the more, if you're a first generation student, it's, as an undergraduate, it's an even bigger deal. There's this phenomenon, I don't know if Georgia State discovered it, but I learned about it from them, called summer melt, where a student, they apply to school, they get accepted to school, they say they're coming, they never show up. Why not? Well, for 100 different reasons. They got to get a parent to sign a form, and they haven't known where that parent, they haven't been in contact with that parent for years, or they've got to get some kind of medical form that they don't know how to get, or they need transportation. They can't, they need transportation to get somewhere, to get something that they don't have, right? There are all these obstacles. There's all this friction involved. And even, even being at school, right? There's all this friction involved. When you're 18 years old and your job is to go to school, right? That's quite different than this kinds of scenarios we're talking about today. So how do we deal with that problem? I mean, we had a slide up earlier about mental health services. That. How do you deal with that problem?
Yeah. Well, I think we deal with it together. So we all have to recognize that we in this room are part of an ecosystem where we are trying to help that student achieve outcomes. Also in that ecosystem are the corporations that I talked about earlier, the employers. And in this room, we have a network of a great many schools and a great many approaches to doing things. And together, we have to understand how to manage that student journey from the minute we are introduced to that student to the point where that student is successful in their next endeavor. We need to meet them where they are, and we need to move forward. And that is a team sport. So part of the reason that the Learning House exists, in fact, I would argue that the only reason the Learning House exists and that Wiley Education Services exists is to help this ecosystem work better. Help this ecosystem identify the students that are the right students to be in your school, that can succeed, that can matriculate, that can achieve outcomes in school so that they can achieve outcomes out of school. That's the reason that we exist. And in this room, there is all sorts of expertise around that. And through this network, there is power. There's power because our job is to work with all of you to help all of you succeed. And that student journey, which Todd and I talk about all the time, we have a weekly meeting that's on effectively on the student journey in one form or fashion. That's our mission in life. And so to the extent that we can learn through data, through study, what works in terms of identifying the right student, getting them to, look, the main reason students don't show up is ultimately wasn't right for them in the first place. The main reason that they drop out is ultimately wasn't right for them in the first place. Not because the degree wasn't necessarily right, but maybe they couldn't afford it, or maybe they were working and they took on too heavy a load. Maybe they just couldn't put it all together, and so they got one semester in and forgot why they were there in the first place. Or maybe they got into it and they got into the wrong degree program. And therefore, they woke up one day and said, "Oh, crime scene investigation sounded so cool when I read it on the subway, but there aren't really a lot of those jobs." Drop out. So our job is also to start with what are the in-demand jobs, in-demand skills that we can help people to pursue so that we can work with all of you to find the best way to do it. My point is there's power in the collective learning that we have. We can be the best partner for that student in addition to being the best partner for school. That's what our mission is. And so I think that there's a big lesson in that. There's also a tremendous power in the room.
Just want to remind you all.
I just complimented you all, so I want you to know that. Flatter the audience. Fireside Chat 101. I may not be an astronaut.
Right.
I think everybody should start their talks in this conference. I may not be an astronaut or a wide receiver, but we are educators. We've got one of the three things, right?
Right. And I can't catch a football either. Just want to remind y'all, feel free to jump in with a question at any time. So I'm a big believer in that notion that as educators, we're all in this together and we need to be working together. That is, to me, I was raised, again, in family business, and that is, to me, sort of the heart of education. At the same time, all of y'all in the audience here have a responsibility to the sustainability of your institutions financially. And so you face the unpleasant reality that you are competing with some of the folks down the road from you. Now, how far down the road is an open question, right? And we're getting some data that are interesting and changing and so on. And that we're changing not only in terms of the, the distance effects that we're seeing, and also the prices that of advertising, are changing. So the cost of reach is changing, but demographics are changing as well. So I live in Western Massachusetts, and I got to tell you, the demographics up there for schools. Anyone here in New England? Or yeah, it's scary. So everybody, first of all, you've got Southern New Hampshire hanging over as a giant shadow over everyone. SUNY has announced that they're going to do something. We don't know what. They don't know what. Something. UMass has announced they're going to do something. We don't know what. They don't know what. Something, right? These are big universities that have been in the online business forever, right? These are pioneers, right? We've had all kinds of school closures, several of which were on Todd's slides this morning. I could name half a dozen others that weren't. There are a handful that are more that are in danger that I could name off the top of my head, including my daughter's college, Hampshire College, which is not a low-quality school that one would expect to be in danger of closing, right? And the demographics are only going to get worse. So there are fewer and fewer students out there to have lifelong relationships with. How do you deal with that? And first of all, is it a law of physics? I mean, is that an iron law that you're only going to be able to reach those students in your local area? And if so, what do you do about it?
We deal with the world that we live in, and what we know is that there are an enormous number of people in this nation and around the world that want and need life-changing education. It is probably true that this country, are there any international representatives in the House? Okay, there are a couple, so I'll try to be balanced, but predominantly not. So I'll speak mostly about North America. We have, and by the way, Learning Houses and Wes are international as well. We believe broadly in the global promise, but it is probably true that we're not going to see explosive growth in the overall enrollment in this country of 4-degree programs. But what we will see is we will see those that provide, we'll see a couple of things. The first thing we'll see is those that provide a good return on investment in it for their students, as opposed to, again, simply more. It has to be more, better, leading to a return. We will see those being the ones that survive. We will see those that can that service their local community as the ones that survive. There's this myth of the national university that's maybe what you're referring to with the dark storm cloud. I don't know that I buy it. I mean, I think there may be certain brands that can be national, but we serve schools in communities where the schools are vital to that community and to that region. And to the extent that they are serving the needs of that community, what will be true in the future is what has been true all along, which is that people like to affiliate with institutions that are in their area, in their region. Most of the catchment area for most schools, as I'm sure you're all familiar, regardless of whether it's on ground or online, is reasonably local. Within a few hours drive, a couple hours drive at the most. And I think that will continue to be true. And then if we look at that market that we're in, and we ask ourselves what's actually needed, and we start to go after the job categories that are growing, and we service those job categories well, and we start to think about different products that we could bring to them, whether it be technology education or teacher education, which are two areas that we're pioneering at the Learning House, and we start to break that down to the credentials and certificates that those people need beyond that, there's growth in that. But more importantly, I don't want to create a vision of a pipe dream of all of a sudden we're going to be doing, you know, $20 certificates. But what I'm suggesting is those that provide a true return on investment to their students and to their communities will be the ones that that survive, and those schools will be magnets for growth. It may just be growth in the area. I can't promise that we in this room will change the entire trajectory of enrollment, but we will be attracting students because we will be helping them on this continuous loop.
Let's talk a little bit more about international, because I've heard conflicting stories about that. It wasn't too many years ago that you'd hear once a week, well, if India built a university a week for the next 20 years, they couldn't keep up with demand. And back when I was working at SUNY, you know, there was this kind of idea that, you know, if only, I won't pick on any particular SUNY campus, but if only SUNY unnamed campus could get their turf grass management program online, there were millions and millions of students out there who would take it elsewhere. But on the other hand, there really are millions and millions of students around the world. We are entering an era where it is possible to imagine every student, every human in the world being able to get access to education that allows them to learn to their full potential. How much of a gap, how much of a possibility is there to realize that practically for colleges represented in this room in the next, say, 5 to 10 years?
That's a very good question. Look, we in this this world invest more in education every year, and that's happening in the States. It's also happening worldwide. There's more money going into education. We're trying to get more people through the system for the same reasons that we talked about earlier. It's the tried and true, proven way to raise people from the lower class to the middle class and raise societies into prosperity. I think we face some headwinds right now in globalizing that because we have a growing called a populism that is basically putting up some barriers to the global flow of students, but there are many schools that are achieving great things by attracting international students. We have the gold standard of higher education in this country, and it has been a proven magnet for many years. As I say, there's some headwinds right now. I think in the long run, there's nothing that should prevent us from continuing to achieve that goal. But typically, well, I'll leave it there. There's potential. We're going to have to work hard to achieve it, to realize that potential in the years to come. But it is absolutely material upside for every school in the room.
Okay, so let's leave it at that then for the moment and return to the opportunity at hand, which is the students in your local area, serving a higher percentage of them better for a longer period of time. Right, figuring out how to serve them at different stages in their lives, right? So you can think about that in two different ways. One is I've got to serve. Actually, I'm going to pause because I can see we have a question coming up. So
I didn't mean to interrupt you. Full sentence there, Michael.
Please do.
Bob Bonner from BT Consulting Group. I'm curious. You know, there've been criticism of companies like Wiley being involved in education. So there was a Kevin Carey article about the creeping capitalism of companies like Wiley. And I think the primary criticism there was that you weren't taking costs out of the system, you were adding costs into the system. And I know there's a million things you do, but I'm curious to hear your response to that article and that criticism that you're adding costs as opposed to taking costs out of the system.
Yeah, so we don't survive another year if we're not helping universities achieve their objective. Full stop. We have built a flexible approach to doing what we do. We believe we have the gold standard. We don't know that, we wouldn't say that there aren't others that do a great job at helping universities succeed, but we think we do a darn good job of it, and I think our results speak for themselves in terms of the growth of the programs, and the growth of the schools, and the growth of the programs that we participate in. So if you take the success of our school partners as indicia of us helping them, or indicia of the value of our services, you have to say that there is a relationship that is somehow working. So now, what's the problem, and what are people focused on, and what are people complaining about? Well, part of it is that there's an immune system response that's happening in the industry right now to things that, to some people, look an awful lot like what happened in the for-profit era, where there were a variety of abuses that happened in the recruitment of students, in false advertising, in the marketing of worthless degrees, and the running up of student debt, and the like. It, by the way, wasn't only for-profits that were doing that stuff. There were some not-for-profits that were engaging in the self-same practices. But I think what we're seeing now is I think there's a bit of an immune response going on because companies and universities are partnering. And this idea of public-private partnership is, to some, a challenging notion. They believe that education should be a nonprofit zone, and that there is, and that many of them believe that education should be free. And I think we all would aspire to the fact that lower cost education, more people have access to it, fantastic thing. So that article and the people that are purporting to be helping advance a system where there aren't abuses and conflicts of interest, I think are in part responding to a different problem. Here we have a public-private partnership that is purely about helping the universities to achieve their objectives. And we, as Wiley, make no mistake, are willing to work with schools in whatever way works for them. Now, if through that process there's an implicit competition for demand for marketing to students, which is basically part of the nub of this problem, is that the more money that goes into attracting online students, the more the ad rates go up, and therefore all the money's going to Google. Okay, fair enough. Schools spend money on marketing; they always have, and presumably they always will. But to me, that's a sideshow. That doesn't say anything about motivations or something bad about public-private partnerships, or that we shouldn't be in the business at all. So I think that there is a root in this whole thing that we have to come back to, which is what is right for the student. Are we giving the student a good return on investment? If we together are giving the student a good return on investment, then the partners are succeeding and we're succeeding. If we're succeeding and the partners are succeeding because the return on investment's there, meaning that the ecosystem's working and they're getting jobs at the end of the day that allow them to pay off their debt, and student debt isn't rising as a result of all this, unsustainable student debt, then we're doing a good job. Now now take that and flip it on its head. Take the expertise that we are learning at our 60+ universities out of the equation for any one of you. Take our ability to bring best practices, take our ability to identify the right programs, to matriculate those students to the extent we can support. Obviously, we all have different relationships. Take that out of the system. Are you really increasing opportunity for students, or are you decreasing opportunity for students? I would argue the latter, because what's going to happen is fewer schools are going to be able to survive in the long run, because fewer schools will be able to provide the programs online and on ground that are meeting with the needs of the specific students. So I'm not, by the way, I'm very resonant to the notion of the potential for abuse. But there is nothing in my world that makes that more likely in in these relationships than in any other organization, profit or not for profit, anywhere in the world. So I think it's a great conversation for us to have. We are absolutely open to being transparent and to having regulatory, having rules for how you do business. But this is a far cry from what happened during the run-up of the for-profits, where basically investors were coming to the free money government window and downloading student loan monies into their pockets and walking away and giving the students nothing for it. Does anybody in this room believe we're not giving those students value? And if you do, then we all have a problem. So anyway, that's a long answer to a short but a very important question, because this topic is in the air. And I'm here to say we're here to be your partner, and if we can do that on terms that are different than the terms we have, then we're willing to have that conversation.
Let me ask two targeted follow-up questions, if I may, Brian. I'm generally not in favor of any article that starts with a graphic with bugs crawling down the screen. But this is an important topic, and there are some real complexities, in part because I'm going to use a word that I think makes academics uncomfortable, but university business models are complex. And there are often unintended consequences. I'm going to give one example that's outside the OPM space and then ask you two questions that are related to this problem. So outside the OPM space, there are various ways in which people are, with the best of intentions, trying to help students, whether it's by having them spend 2 years at community college, or having them take courses through companies like Straighterline and get credits for their survey courses and so on. Avoid having to pay for those gen ed courses and lower their total cost of education, which we'd all like to see, right? What was not clear is that in the university business model, those gen ed courses actually cross-subsidize a lot of the smaller courses, foreign languages and so on and so forth. So there were some sustainability consequences to many colleges and universities. So you can argue whether that's a, good thing or a bad thing, but it was an unforeseen thing that happened when those things were decoupled, right? So with that example in mind, when you have a revenue share, right? We all know that there is the sticker price for a college education, and then there's the actual price that students pay, the discount price, right? They're often wildly different. Okay? When there's a revenue share, 50-50, that reduces the university's ability, in many cases, to give a discount price. So, because they just don't have as much money to peel off to play with. So, what kind of conversation do we need to have about the specific impact of the revenue share on the actual price that students end up paying for degrees in that particular contractual situation?
That's a big and broad question. I would say that part of our partnership is making sure that part of our partnership should be a dialogue about what the right way to price degrees is. But ultimately, that typically does not reside in our hands, as you will know. As we move forward in this business, There's a level set here, right? The level set is that there are material costs that go along with being a school's partner.
Yeah.
And to date, very few of the providers of these services have actually been profitable. So it's quite interesting to have a conversation that talks about profit when in fact the providers, excess profit, when in fact the providers haven't actually provided any profit. But be that as it may, so if there is if you take those things together and you say that there is a bunch of cost involved in being a school's partner, and that there is not, by definition, excess profit because there's no profit dropping out of the economic equation, you have to basically say, well, those costs are going to be borne by somebody. So I'm not sure, Michael, how exactly that limits the flexibility of a school's price. I don't actually get that. So I'm struggling to answer the question directly.
So to be clear, I'm not suggesting there's any gouging going on, right? But I'm suggesting, let's say the degree is, sticker price is $20,000, right? And normally the university says, okay, we have we often will discount it down to 12. I'm just making these numbers up, right? And we're paying, but we're splitting the cost, and we're getting what we're paying for. I'm not saying that we're, not getting what we're paying for. But we're paying now 10 of that $20,000 that we're getting, that we would be charging for that degree to our OPM provider. So, and we have our own costs. Does that impact our ability to take off that $8,000 to what we charge to the student? What more broadly, what are the conversations that you have with your customers, with your partners, about how, in the context of your relationship, you can bring the total discount price down for the student, so that it is in line with or lower than what they would pay outside of a rev share relationship. Let me put it that way. Is that a conversation that you have?
I think that we're in a very complex topic where we have a negative time remaining.
Okay.
What I will say is, I'm just looking at the 4 minutes that we're over now, and this is an important topic. Look, we have an interest in increasing accessibility of education. That's core to what we're doing. We've talked about that. We have a commitment to making that education affordable. We have a commitment to making sure that education matches up with the needs of the marketplace so that the students get the return on investment, society gets return on its investment in education. And finally, we have a commitment, and this is a core Wiley thing, it's in all of our businesses, a commitment to partnership. You see it in our research business, where we as a research publisher are the largest partner, largest society partner, and for those of you who don't know the research world all that well, academic societies are where a lot of the, are the brands under which a lot of the research is published, societies of scientists. We are the leading publisher in the world. We have 800 some odd partners there. We have 10,000 partners on the university partners on that side of the business. We have the largest network of partners in this part of the business. On our corporate training business, we have hundreds and hundreds of globally leading companies that are our partners. My answer to your question is, we're committed to the right stuff. We're committed to partnership, and that partnership allows us to get into a conversation with the people in this room about what the right product is, what the right distribution channel is, what the right marketing program is, what the right pricing is. We have the opportunity to have those conversations. We are committed to the right outcomes for society. And that's, you know, what 30 years in this business tells me. And look, I grew up, like Leland, I wanted to be a wide receiver. I wasn't one. Like Leland, I wanted to be an astronaut. I wasn't one. So the only option left for me of his trio of the greatest things you could possibly be in the world, according to Brian Napack, a kid who grew up in the S section in Roslyn Heights on Long Island, the only thing I had is education. Okay? So I personally am committed to that partnership, to the outcomes that we're talking about, and that means something to me. It means something to Jesse Wiley and his family. It means something to Todd Zipper and to Matt Hillman and to every one of our colleagues in this room and every one of our partners in this room. I know that. That's why I do what I do. That's why I left the reasonably cushy world of private equity, which we all think will be lovely to be in, right? The investment world, to come back to this beautiful sailing ship that I talked about on day one. I love that we're in this business. I love that you are our partners. I hope together we can solve all of these incredible problems that society faces, and we have the answer. The answer is the development, the application, the dissemination of knowledge, which we do together to help society achieve its goals. So I know that is totally a pivot on the question you asked, but it's what I wanted to say, so I get to say it.
Well,
I might step in for a second, and if this is working, and take some liberty to answer the question a little bit, because I think this is part of the misconception of the OPM industry. Discounting really happens only at the residential level. So when we come in, whether it's Learning House or West, there's very, very rarely any discounting, maybe a scholarship. And in at least, and I know the contracts intimately on the Learning House side, we always, our share comes after that discount happens. So your analogy of the 20 to 12 and we're taking 10, there's no way that could ever exist. So the 40 to 50% discount rate that seems to keep increasing every year on the residential side is this vicious cycle that some of our schools in here, like in Cordy St. Paul and a couple of others, have tried to break that cycle by kind of go to a lower singular price point with very little discounting of it. So that's, okay. We could take that offline, but there's a lot of misconception around this model, and it leads to this, you know, we're taking 80% of the net tuition or whatever that analogy is, and that's not happening.
Okay. So I know we're out of time. I have one last question for you, Brian.
But Todd's better than me, so he may have to answer.
Do you believe that the fact that you've paid me to be here would have me say anything that I didn't believe was true?
Not for a second. I've known you for a long time, and you have integrity.
Okay. So we're out of time. There was a complex question that was brought up that we didn't have time to deal with in depth. So I just want to say in fairness that I trust these guys on this. So thank you for your time. It was a pleasure to speak to both of you, and it's a pleasure to speak to all of you. Enjoy your summer.
Thank you very much, Michael. Great stuff.
10-minute break, and we'll get started with the next keynote.
All right.